The email arrived at 2:34 a.m., a single message with no subject. The sender's address was a string of meaningless letters and numbers, random, untraceable. Attached were 6 photographs. James Reynolds sat upright in bed, the glow of his laptop, screen casting sharp shadows across his face. His hands trembled as he clicked on the first image. His wife, Claire, nude, tangled in the sheets of a bed that was not theirs. A man, faceless in the angle of the shots, draped over her like a lover, possessed. The sequence of images left no room for misinterpretation. James shut the laptop with a snap, his breath shallow, his pulse thundering in his ears. His first instinct was disbelief. Claire, the woman he had loved for a decade, the woman who smiled at him over coffee every morning, who kissed him goodnight as though nothing else in the world mattered. His second instinct was fury. Who sent these? Why? And most of all, was this real? He fought the impulse to storm into the bedroom and wake her, to demand answers. No, that was what a fool would do. James was many things, but never a fool. He would investigate first. He would gather evidence, dig beneath the surface before confronting her. And so, his descent into darkness began. By morning, James had traced the metadata from the images, scrubbed clean, of course, but there was something else. A subtle detail in the background of the third image, a distinctive painting, slightly blurred but unmistakable. A gold-framed landscape of a lake at sunset. James knew that painting. It hung in room 428 of the Mercer Hotel. He called in sick to work, his mind churning. He would go to the hotel, check their records, confirm the dates. His hands clenched into fists as he thought about Claire's explanations, her deceptions. Would she lie? Would she cry? Would she deny everything until he shoved the proof in her face? He reached the Mercer by noon. A crisp bill across the receptionist's desk earned him a peek at their records. Room 428 had been booked 2 weeks ago. A Mr. Alan Sloan. Alan Sloan. The name meant nothing to him, but it was a lead. The confrontation came that evening. Claire was in the kitchen when James walked in, his expression unreadable. "We need to talk." She turned, her eyes warm, innocent. "Of course, honey, what's wrong?" James placed the printed photographs on the counter between them. "Explain." The color drained from her face. "James, I don't know what this is." "Don't lie to me. Room 428, Mercer Hotel, 2 weeks ago. Alan Sloan. Who is he?" Her lips parted, her breath hitching, and then something unexpected happened. She laughed, not a laugh of amusement, but of sheer disbelief. "Alan Sloan? James, that's..." She swallowed, shaking her head. "That's your alias. You use it for business trips." A cold dread curled in James's stomach. "What?" She stepped forward, her voice trembling. "James, someone is trying to destroy us. You never booked that room? You never took those photos?" Her eyes searched his. "Because if you didn't, who did?" A sharp knock at the door shattered the moment. James and Claire turned. A silhouette loomed behind the frosted glass, a shadow from a nightmare. James reached for the doorknob with a sudden, dawning realization. This wasn't just betrayal, this was a trap, and they were already caught in it. Whoever was at the door knocked again, louder this time. James exchanged a look with Claire. Her fear mirrored his own, but there was something else in her eyes now. Urgency. Without a word, she grabbed his wrist and pulled him away from the entrance, her voice a whisper. "We don't open it," she said. The knock turned into pounding. "James Reynolds," a voice called out, low and commanding. "Open the door, now!" James's mind spun. If someone had fabricated those photos, if someone had gone to the extent of booking a hotel room under his alias, then this wasn't about an affair at all. This was something bigger. He reached into the drawer beneath the counter, his fingers, closing around cold steel, his old service revolver, a relic from his days in law enforcement. Claire's eyes widened, but she said nothing. The lock rattled. Whoever was on the other side wasn't waiting for permission anymore. James exhaled slowly. If this was a trap, he needed to spring it on his terms. With one hand, he unlatched the door. It swung open. Two men in dark suits stepped inside, their presence dominating the space. No badges, no introductions, just a quiet, unspoken authority. The taller of the two closed the door behind them. The shorter man, his eyes sharp and assessing, reached into his jacket and pulled out a small black envelope. He placed it on the counter next to the printed photographs. "You've been looking in the wrong direction, Mr. Reynolds." James said nothing. He wasn't going to give them anything. The man nodded toward Claire. "And your wife?" "Well, she's in just as much danger as you." Claire's grip tightened around James's arm. "Who are you?" she demanded. The man gave a thin smile. "We're the ones keeping you alive." James looked at the envelope, then back at them. "And if I don't open that?" The taller man finally spoke, his voice as deep as a funeral bell. "Then you die blind." The room fell into silence. James reached for the envelope, his hand steady despite the storm inside him. He slid it open and pulled out a single photograph, not of Claire, not of himself, but of the faceless man in the hotel room. Only now, the man had a face, and it was someone James knew, someone he trusted, someone who should have been dead. James felt his stomach drop as realization dawned. "Oh my God," Claire whispered, because the man in the photograph wasn't a stranger. It was James's best friend. James's fingers tightened around the photograph, his pulse a steady drumbeat of disbelief. His best friend, Ethan Carter. But Ethan was dead, had been for 5 years, killed in a supposed car accident. James had been at the funeral, had delivered the eulogy, had spent years grieving the man who had been closer than a brother. And yet, here he was, alive, naked in a bed with Claire. His breath came slow, measured. He felt Claire shift beside him, but he couldn't look at her, not yet. Instead, his eyes locked onto the two men standing before him. "Tell me what this is." The shorter man gave a slow nod as if he expected this reaction. "Not here." James let out a bitter chuckle. "You barge into my home, drop this in my lap, and now you want me to just follow you?" The taller man finally spoke again. "We don't want you to, but if you don't, the people who will come next won't be so polite." James exchanged a glance with Claire. She was pale, shaking. But there was something else in her eyes now, a glimmer of something dark, something dangerous. She knew something, and that terrified him more than anything else. 15 minutes later, they were in the back of a black SUV, the city lights blurring, past as the vehicle sped through the streets. The tension inside was suffocating. James clutched the photograph so tightly that the edges crumpled. Finally, he turned to Claire. "Tell me the truth." She swallowed hard. "James." "Now." Claire took a shuddering breath. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Ethan's not dead." James clenched his jaw. "I gathered that much." She shook her head. "No, you don't understand. Ethan didn't fake his death. He was erased." James frowned. "What? Do you mean erased?" The shorter man, who had yet to give his name, sighed and turned slightly in his seat. "Your friend was part of a project, Mr. Reynolds. A project that never should have existed." James's blood ran cold. "Ethan was CIA." The man nodded. "Was. Until he saw something he wasn't supposed to. Something that made him a liability." James's grip tightened on the seat. "So they killed him." "Tried to," the man corrected. "But Ethan was smart. He disappeared before they could finish the job. James exhaled, his mind racing. And Claire? The man hesitated. Then, with a measured tone, he said, "She's the only reason he came back." James turned slowly toward Claire. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her eyes downcast. "Explain," he said, voice low. Tears glistened in her eyes. "James." "I had no choice." He stared at her, heart hammering. "No choice in what?" She finally looked up, and the guilt in her expression shattered him. "I never stopped loving him." The words sliced through James like a blade. The betrayal, the deception. It all made sense now. But before he could react, the SUV jerked violently to the side. Tires screeched, metal crunched, a flash of blinding light. Then, darkness. And James knew, without a doubt, that they had found them. James awoke to the scent of burning rubber and the sound of distant sirens. His head throbbed, his vision swimming as he tried to focus. The SUV was on its side, windshield shattered, smoke curling from the engine. Claire. He turned his head, coughing against the acrid air. Claire lay slumped against the door, blood trickling from a cut on her forehead. He reached for her, shaking her shoulder. "Claire! Wake up!" She stirred, groaning, eyes fluttering open. Relief flooded through him, until he remembered what she had said just before the crash. "I never stopped loving him." James clenched his jaw, shoving that thought aside. Right now, survival came first. A groan came from the front of the vehicle. The shorter man, the one who had given James the photograph, was barely conscious, pinned by the dashboard. The taller man, however, was gone. The driver's seat was empty, the door ripped open, which meant someone had taken him or he had run. James braced himself against the wreckage and pulled himself out through the shattered side window. The night air hit him like ice. Around them, the streets were eerily empty, save for the flickering streetlights casting long, jagged shadows. Then he saw them. Figures emerging from the alleyways, moving with the kind of precision that only came from extensive training. No markings, no words, just silent, relentless intent. "Killers! Claire, move!" He reached inside the wreckage, grabbed the unconscious agent's pistol from his holster, and fired the moment the first figure raised his weapon. A sharp crack echoed through the street, and the man dropped. The others advanced. Claire was already scrambling out of the SUV, glass slicing her palms. "James! Run!" She hesitated only for a second before taking off down the alley. James followed, his pulse pounding in his ears. He fired another shot over his shoulder, forcing their pursuers to take cover. They ran, through twisting back streets, over fences, into the shadows of the forgotten parts of the city. James didn't stop, didn't think. He just moved, pulling Claire with him, the sound of boots pounding behind them. Then, silence. James pressed Claire against the wall of a crumbling warehouse, his own back against the cold brick. His breath came in ragged gulps. The gun felt heavy in his grip, a familiar weight from a past life. Claire's fingers clutched his jacket. "James, we need to—" A voice cut through the night. "James." A chill ran down his spine. It wasn't their pursuers. It was him. James turned slowly, gun raised. Ethan Carter stood in the alley, hands up in mock surrender. He looked different, thinner, harder, shadows deepening the lines on his face. But there was no mistaking him. He was alive, and James had never wanted to kill someone more. "I can explain," Ethan said. James didn't lower the gun. "Start talking. Fast." Ethan took a step forward. "They're not after you." His gaze flickered to Claire. "They're after her." Claire stiffened. "What?" Ethan's expression was grim. "Claire, they don't care about me anymore. They know I exist. But you—" He exhaled. "You have something they need." James glanced at her. "What is he talking about?" Claire shook her head. "I don't—" She stopped, eyes widening. Ethan nodded, as if he could see the realization dawn in her mind. "You do know, don't you?" James's patience snapped. "Someone explain. Now." Claire's breath was shaky. "James, before Ethan died, he told me something dangerous." James's grip on the gun tightened. "What?" She swallowed hard. "A name." James frowned. "A name?" Ethan's eyes darkened. "A name that can bring down an entire section of the government." James felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. Whatever Claire knew, whatever name she had buried in her memory, it was enough to make people kill for it. Enough to have made Ethan erase himself from existence. Claire's voice was barely a whisper, and I think I finally remember what it is. The sound of approaching footsteps cut through the night. They were out of time. The footsteps drew closer, steady and deliberate. Whoever was coming wasn't in a rush. They knew they had them cornered. James tightened his grip on the gun, his body coiled, ready. Ethan had no weapon, at least none visible, but James had. Seen him fight before. He could hold his own. Claire's breath hitched. "James!" He glanced at her. She looked terrified, but not just from the danger, from the name in her head. "Tell me," James demanded. "What's the name?" Claire swallowed hard. Her lips trembled as she whispered, "Senator Malcolm Riker." James froze. The name hit, like a hammer. Malcolm Riker wasn't just some bureaucrat. He was one of the most powerful men in the country. A senator with deep ties to intelligence agencies, black budget projects, and whispered rumors of things that shouldn't exist. James had spent years in law enforcement. He knew the name. And he knew one thing for sure. Malcolm Riker was untouchable. Until now. Ethan exhaled. "I was right." James turned on him, fury flashing in his eyes. "You knew? You let us run blind while you waited for her to remember?" Ethan's jaw clenched. "She had to remember on her own. If I forced it, they would have known. They've been watching, listening." James took a step closer, gun raising slightly. "And what the hell does Riker want?" Ethan hesitated. Claire answered instead. "It's not what he wants. It's what he did." Before James could demand more, a deep voice echoed from the darkness. "Step away from the woman." James turned sharply. A man stood at the entrance of the alley, backlit by a single street lamp. He was older, tall, with a commanding presence, the kind of man who never needed to raise his voice to command obedience, and James recognized him instantly. Agent Victor Harrington, CIA. The last time James had seen him was 3 years ago when he left law enforcement behind. He never thought he'd see the man again. Yet here he was. "James," Harrington said, his voice calm, "hand over Claire. Walk away. This isn't your fight." James let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You crashed my car. Try to kill us. And now you want me to just hand her over?" Harrington didn't blink. "If you don't, you won't leave this alley alive." Behind James, Ethan tensed. Claire gripped James's arm. "James," she whispered, "we can't let them take me." James knew she was right. If the CIA got their hands on her, she wouldn't just disappear. She would cease to exist. He lifted the gun slightly. "Not happening." Harrington sighed, as if disappointed. He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out something small and metallic. He tossed it toward James, who caught it on reflex, a flash drive. "What's this?" James asked, narrowing his eyes. Harrington met his gaze, voice steady. "Proof." James frowned. "Proof of what?" Harrington exhaled. "That Malcolm Riker isn't just after Claire, he's after you." James felt a cold weight settle in his gut, and then before he could react, the first gunshot rang out, and the alley exploded into chaos. The crack of the gunshot echoed off the alley walls. Instinct took over. James shoved Claire down, spinning toward the source of the shot. Ethan had already moved, diving for cover behind a dumpster. Harrington remained standing, unflinching, as if expecting the bullet. But it hadn't been meant for him. A shadowed figure crumpled to the pavement behind him, gun still clutched in a lifeless grip. Someone else had been watching. Someone else had pulled the trigger. Ethan swore under his breath. They're cleaning house, James's mind raced. If Riker's people were willing to shoot their own just to keep this contained, then they were running out of time. Harrington turned to James, his face unreadable. We don't have much longer before more show up. James's grip tightened. On the flash drive. What's on this? Harrington hesitated, then, in a rare moment of transparency, said, Enough to bring Riker down. James didn't trust him. But at this moment, the enemy of his enemy might be the only thing keeping them alive. Claire was still on the ground, her breathing ragged. She had remembered something dangerous. And now, she was a target. James helped her up. We need to move. Harrington nodded, gesturing toward the far end of the alley. I have a car 3 blocks down. We need to get to a secure location and... Ethan's voice cut through the night. No. James turned to him. What? Ethan stood, shaking his head. We don't run, not anymore. His eyes burned with something fierce, something personal. They're never going to stop, James. Riker's reach is too deep. You think hiding will work? That getting to a safe house will fix this? Ethan took a step forward. No, we end it tonight. Claire looked between them. Ethan, what are you saying? Ethan's jaw clenched. I'm saying we take the fight to him. James narrowed his eyes. You're talking about Riker? Ethan nodded. He's not expecting us to go on the offensive. Right now, he thinks we're running scared. That gives us an opening. Harrington crossed his arms. And what exactly is your plan, Carter? Walk into his office and shoot him? Ethan's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. Not quite. He turned to James. That flash drive? It's not just evidence. It's leverage, James frowned. Leverage for what? Ethan exhaled. To make him expose himself. James glanced at Claire, then back at Ethan. This was insane. And yet, it was the only way. He tucked the flash drive into his pocket. Tell me what you're thinking. Ethan's expression hardened. We set a trap, and just like that, the hunt began. 2 hours later, the penthouse suite of the Blackwood Hotel overlooked the entire city, golden lights stretching into the darkness like veins of fire. A perfect view for a man like Malcolm Riker, who thrived in the shadows while controlling everything beneath him. And tonight, he was walking into his own execution. James adjusted the earpiece in his ear, listening to Ethan's voice on the other end. He just arrived. 2 bodyguards, both armed. No sign of Harrington. James glanced at Claire. She was pale but steady, her hand gripping the flash drive like it was the last thing tethering her to reality. Showtime, Ethan muttered. The plan was simple. Give Riker exactly what he wanted, and then rip it away. The setup Ethan had called in a favor, using old contacts to leak information that Claire was willing to sell the flash drive. A desperate woman, hunted and alone, looking to disappear in exchange for her freedom. Riker had taken the bait. James, playing the role of the disgraced husband, would be her reluctant escort, ensuring the deal went through smoothly. If all went well, Riker would leave that room believing he'd won, until the real game began. The penthouse. The moment they stepped inside, James felt the weight of Riker's gaze. He was an imposing man, tall, silver-haired, and radiating the kind of quiet authority that made people afraid to even breathe wrong around him. His tailored suit barely concealed the armor beneath it, and his smile was that of a predator already tasting blood. Well, well, Riker said, swirling a glass of whiskey. I must say, Claire, I didn't think you had it in you. Claire didn't flinch. I just want out. Riker took a slow sip, watching her. Then he turned to James. And you? Still playing the good husband? James forced a bitter smirk. Good husbands don't sell out their wives. Riker chuckled, amused. Fair enough. He gestured toward the flash drive. Shall we? Claire hesitated, just enough to sell the act. Then she slid the flash drive across the table. Riker picked it up, rolling it between his fingers. Tell me, James, he mused. Do you know what's on here? James met his gaze. Enough to make you nervous. Riker smirked. You're not wrong. He turned to one of his bodyguards. Verify it. The man took the flash drive and plugged it into a laptop, scanning through the files. A tense silence filled the room. Then the bodyguard nodded. It's legit. Riker exhaled, as if this was the moment he had been waiting for. Good. That simplifies things. Then he pulled out a gun. The betrayal James barely had time to react before Riker aimed not at Claire, but at him. You were always a problem, James, he said, voice smooth. Even after you left law enforcement, I knew it was only a matter of time before you got in my way. James's jaw clenched. So what now? You kill me and let Claire walk? Riker chuckled. Oh, she was never walking away. He turned to Claire. Did you really think I'd let you sell me out? You were dead the moment you stepped into this hotel. Claire's breath hitched. This was the moment. James caught the tiniest nod from her, the signal, and then the hotel room exploded with movement. The reversal Ethan's voice crackled in James's earpiece. Now, the power cut out. The lights died, plunging the room into darkness. A single, flashing red dot appeared on Riker's chest, a sniper's laser. Then another, and another. Ethan had brought friends. Riker went rigid. His bodyguards fumbled for their weapons, but James was faster. He grabbed the whiskey glass from the table and smashed it into the closest man's face. Chaos erupted. James ripped the gun from Riker's grip, pressing it under his jaw before the man could react. The power flickered back on. Riker stood completely still, staring at James with cold calculation. The laser sights remained locked on his chest. Ethan's voice crackled through the speakers of the laptop. Surprise, Senator? Riker exhaled slowly, lips curling. Clever. James leaned in. You've spent years playing God. Tonight that ends. Riker smiled. Does it? A second later, his bodyguards dropped their weapons. James blinked, not because they surrendered, because they had no choice. They were dead. 2 silent shots to the head. James spun toward the window. The snipers hadn't come from Ethan. They had come from someone else, and then a new voice filled the room, smooth, confident, amused. Hello, James. James froze because he knew that voice, knew it better than anyone. Slowly, he turned. And there, standing in the doorway, alive and smirking, was Victor Harrington, the real mastermind. Riker had never been the target. James had been playing the wrong game all along. The room stood still, the air thick with tension. James's grip on his gun tightened as he locked eyes with Victor Harrington. The man had always been a shadowy figure, a puppeteer behind the intelligence community. But standing here now, alive, composed and smirking, James realized he'd severely underestimated him. I have to admit, Harrington said, stepping further into the room, I expected you to be dead by now, but here you are, and you've managed to corner Malcolm Riker. He gestured to the senator who, despite having a gun pressed under his chin, seemed eerily calm. James didn't lower his weapon. What the hell is going on, Victor? Harrington sighed as if disappointed. Oh, James. You still think Riker is the monster here? James narrowed his eyes. He is, Harrington chuckled. No, he's just a pawn. a necessary evil to keep the balance. He turned toward Riker. "Isn't that right, Senator?" Riker exhaled slowly. "I should have known." Claire, still frozen beside James, whispered, "James, I don't like this." Neither did he. Harrington gestured toward the laptop, where the flash drive still sat plugged in. "I assume you took a look at the files?" James hesitated. He hadn't. There hadn't been time. Harrington's smirk widened. "Of course you didn't. You were too busy playing hero." With a slow, deliberate movement, he reached into his pocket and tossed another flash drive onto the table. "What's this?" Ethan's voice crackled through James's earpiece. Harrington raised an eyebrow. "The truth." James glanced at Claire before grabbing the flash drive and plugging it into the laptop. The screen flickered. Then files filled the screen. Classified documents, CIA transcripts, black-budget projects, and at the center of it all, a name that made James's blood run cold. Project Prometheus. Claire's voice was barely a whisper. "What? Is this?" Harrington leaned against the table, watching their reactions. "This is what Riker was protecting, and what you, James, just exposed." James scrolled through the documents. The more he read, the worse it got. Illegal human trials, mind control experiments, political assassinations sanctioned at the highest level. And the worst part? Riker wasn't in charge of it. Harrington was. James turned slowly. "You son of a b..." Harrington chuckled. "Now you're catching up." The deal with the devil. Riker finally spoke, his voice edged with bitterness. "I was never the villain you thought I was, James." James wanted to argue, wanted to believe that the man sitting across from him deserved every bullet he had left, but the truth was staring him in the face. Riker wasn't innocent, but he was a piece in a larger game, and Harrington was the one holding the board. "What now?" James asked. Harrington spread his hands. "That depends. You have two choices." He held up one finger. "One, you walk away. Forget everything you saw here tonight. Let Riker live, and I'll make sure you, Claire, and your little hacker friend survive." Then he held up two fingers. "Two, you play the hero, try to take us down, and we erase you." Claire inhaled sharply. "You're bluffing." Harrington's smirk never faltered. "Am I?" James knew better. Harrington didn't bluff. A long silence stretched between them. Then James did something no one expected. He smiled. Harrington's smirk wavered for the first time. "What's so funny?" James locked eyes with him. "I know something you don't." Harrington's brow furrowed. And then the laptop screen glitched. The files began copying. Harrington's eyes widened. "What the hell?" James turned toward the laptop, where the flash drive wasn't just storing data, it was uploading it to every major news outlet in the country. Ethan's voice crackled in the earpiece. "Hope you weren't planning on keeping this quiet, Harrington." Harrington's face darkened. "You idiot." James shrugged. "You gave me a choice. I picked option 3. Riker's laugh was unexpected. Low. Bitter. He leaned back, shaking his head. "You really are insane." Claire grabbed James's arm. "We have to go. Now." Harrington lunged for the laptop. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Claire and ran. The final chase gunfire erupted behind them as they sprinted for the service exit. James shoved open the door, pulling Claire into the stairwell. "Ethan, tell me you have an exit," James shouted. "Roof. Now," James cursed. "You better have a damn helicopter waiting." "Would I let you down?" Claire shot him a look. "Yes!" James didn't have time to argue. They tore up the stairwell, footsteps thundering behind them. By the time they burst onto the rooftop, the chopper was already hovering. Ethan was inside, leaning out. "Come on!" James boosted Claire. Up first, then grabbed Ethan's hand, just as the door below burst open. Harrington stood there, gun raised. He didn't shoot, didn't shout, he just smiled. Something cold coiled in James' gut. But then the helicopter lifted off, and the rooftop fell away beneath them. Epilogue. They landed hours later in a safe house miles outside the city. James collapsed into a chair, exhausted. 1 month later, the world had moved on. The scandal had erupted like wildfire. Headlines screamed about illegal government projects, mind control experiments, and secret assassinations. The news cycle had been relentless, chewing through every detail of Project Prometheus. For a moment, it seemed like justice might actually win. And then, the cover-up began. Reports were buried. Testimonies were misinterpreted. Key witnesses disappeared. And Malcolm Riker, officially, he had died of a heart attack. The entire country had watched a monster fall, only to realize that someone, worse, had taken his place. Victor Harrington was still in control, and James knew exactly what that meant. The war wasn't over. It was just going underground. A safe house in Lisbon, James sat in the dimly lit apartment, staring at the classified dossier. Ethan had just thrown onto the table. It was thin, almost too thin. No photos, no official documents. No digital trail, just one name. A name James had never seen before. And yet something about it sent a chill down his spine. Claire, sitting beside him, whispered, "Who is John Mercer?" Ethan exhaled. "That's the question, isn't it?" James looked up. "Talk." Ethan leaned against the table, rubbing a hand over his face. "After we exposed Project Prometheus, I went digging. Not just into the CIA, but the deep, ugly back end of it. The part where men like Harrington don't just operate, they answer to someone." James frowned. "You're saying Harrington isn't the top of the chain?" Ethan shook his head. "He never was." He tapped the dossier. "Whoever this John Mercer is, he's the real power behind it all. Every black budget project, every false flag operation, it all leads back to him." Claire's voice was unsteady. "But there's nothing on him." Ethan nodded. "Exactly. He's a ghost." James exhaled slowly. 1 month ago, he had thought, exposing the truth would be enough. Now? He realized the real war was just beginning. He closed the file, his jaw tightening. "We find Mercer," Ethan smirked. "And then what?" James's eyes darkened. "We finish this." Somewhere in Washington, DCA man sat in an office, watching the news. The reporters were still talking about Riker, about the scandal, about the brave whistleblowers who had risked everything to bring the truth to light. The man smiled. They thought. They had won, how quaint. A knock at the door. "Come in." Victor Harrington stepped inside. He looked composed, but his eyes were sharp, watchful. "It's done. Riker is gone." The man nodded. "And the others?" "Scattered. Hiding. But James Carter won't stop." The man chuckled. "I hope not." Harrington hesitated. "Sir, with all due respect, why let them live?" The man leaned forward, his expression calm. "Because we need people like James Carter." Harrington frowned. "For what?" The man's smile widened. "For what's coming next?" Harrington said nothing, because deep down he knew. This had never been about Project Prometheus. It had always been about what came after, and James Carter, he had just stepped into a much bigger game, to be continued. 6 months later, Berlin, Germany. The air was crisp, the streets slick with rain as James Carter walked through the dimly lit alleyway. His movements were careful but unhurried, just another shadow in a city full of them. Berlin had always been a city of spies. Secrets flowed through it like an underground river, silent and deadly. Tonight, James was about to dip his hands into its cold waters. He stopped outside a nondescript cafe, its neon sign flickering above the door. Inside, a lone figure sat in the farthest booth, a glass of whiskey untouched in front of him. James stepped inside, sliding into the booth across from him. The man, thin, balding, with sharp, nervous eyes, exhaled sharply. "You shouldn't have come." James smirked. And yet, here I am. The man licked his lips. His name was Gustav Richter, a former BND analyst who had been quietly erased from Germany's intelligence records 6 years ago. Now he was little more than a ghost. Exactly the kind of man James needed. Gustav glanced around the cafe before leaning in. His voice was barely a whisper. You don't understand what you're up against. James didn't blink. Then make me understand. Gustav hesitated, then pulled out a folder and slid it across the table. James opened it, and his blood ran cold, because there, printed in black and white, was a photo of John Mercer. And he wasn't alone. Victor Harrington stood beside him. James clenched his jaw. I knew Harrington was working for someone, but I didn't think they'd be this close. Gustav nodded grimly. They've been partners for years, but Mercer? He's not just another spy master. He tapped the photo. He's building something. James frowned. What? Gustav exhaled. A new version of Project Prometheus, but bigger, global. James felt his pulse quicken. This isn't just about controlling politicians anymore, Gustav continued. Mercer wants to control everything. Governments, economies, wars. The people in power won't even know they're being used. James closed the folder. Where is he? Gustav hesitated. That's the problem. James leaned forward. Gustav, where is Mercer? Gustav swallowed hard. He's off-grid. Completely. No digital footprint, no phone records, nothing. But... James's eyes narrowed. But what? Gustav glanced around again, his fingers twitching. Then he pulled out a USB drive and slid it across the table. This is everything I have. Bank transfers, flight logs, coded messages, all pointing to a single location. James grabbed the drive. Where? Gustav exhaled. Istanbul. James nodded. Then, the lights inside the cafe flickered. His instincts screamed. He was already reaching for his gun when the window exploded inward. Gunfire erupted. James tackled Gustav to the ground as bullets shredded the table above them. The cafe patrons screamed, diving for cover as masked gunmen stormed inside. James fired twice, dropping one instantly. Gustav scrambled behind the bar, shaking. James grabbed him by the collar. Move! They crashed through the back door into the alleyway, only to come face to face with a black SUV screeching to a halt. The doors flew open, and before James could react, a syringe stabbed into his neck. His vision blurred. His limbs went weak. The last thing he saw was a man in a suit stepping out of the SUV, watching him with calm, assessing eyes. And then, darkness, unknown. Location, James awoke to cold steel beneath him. His head pounded. His limbs were restrained. A single light bulb flickered overhead, casting eerie shadows against the concrete walls. A cell. Footsteps approached. Then a voice. Smooth, confident, familiar. Well, James, you've been busy. James lifted his head. And there, standing in the doorway, his expression one of calm amusement, was John Mercer. He smiled. Let's have a chat. James blinked, his head still throbbing from the drug. His vision was blurry, but he could make out the outline of a tall figure standing in front of him. John Mercer. The man looked the same as the photo Gustav had shown him. Tall, composed, with an air of unshakable power. Mercer was older than James had imagined, his face marked with the faintest traces of age, but still sharp, as if time had only honed his mind further. James tested the restraints around his wrists, the cold metal, digging into his skin. But the more he struggled, the clearer it became. He wasn't going anywhere. Mercer's voice cut through the silence like a razor. You don't need to worry, James. This won't hurt much. James lifted his head, narrowing his eyes. You really think you can control everything? Mercer smiled, walking closer, his polished shoes clicking against the concrete floor. You're underestimating what I've built. He sat down on a metal chair across from James, his gaze never wavering. I'm not interested in petty politics, James. I'm interested in the future. And that future, whether you like it or not, belongs to me. James met his gaze, refusing to break. You don't have the power you think you do. People will stop you. Mercer's smile widened. Oh, James, that's what you don't understand. I am the system. I've built it from the ground up. Through every intelligence agency, every corporation, every corrupt government official. Your little games with Harrington, your so-called resistance. You've only been playing in the margins, insignificant pawns in a much larger chess game. James's stomach twisted. It was worse than he imagined. So, what now? James spat, his voice raw from the drug still fogging his mind. You're going to lecture me about your grand plans for world domination. Mercer chuckled softly. If only it were that simple. The world has already been dominated, James. You just didn't realize it yet. He leaned forward, his voice suddenly cold and serious. You were never meant to stop me. In fact, you were useful. James frowned. Useful how? Mercer's eyes glinted with something dark. You've been an asset, a valuable pawn to shake things up. That's why I let you play this little game with Harrington. You, Claire Riker. It was all a distraction, a way for me to cleanse the system. Every exposed lie, every ruined career, every piece of truth you dug up, it all led back to me. And now, it's time to tie up the loose ends. James's heart skipped a beat. So what? You just kill me and walk away? Mercer's face softened. For a moment, almost as if he was amused by the suggestion. No, James, you're going to help me, whether you like it or not. He stood, circling James slowly. There's still so much you don't know. You've only scratched the surface. Your little investigation, that was just the beginning of what I'm about to do. You'll help me understand how far I've gotten with this system. You'll help me because you know the consequences if you don't. James's pulse quickened. What do you want from me? Mercer stopped in front of him, crouching slightly to look James dead in the eyes. You're going to make me a list, James, of every person who could potentially expose what I've built. The truth about Project Prometheus, the experiments, the control. The real power behind every government decision, every financial market, names, locations, weaknesses. James's heart pounded in his chest. The realization hit him like a freight train. You're asking me to betray everything I believe in. Mercer's smile was slow, but deadly. I'm not asking you to betray anything. I'm simply asking you to be realistic. You see, in this world, the truth is what I say it is. And the people who want to stop me, they're expendable. James's mind raced. He was trapped in a cage, a prison with no windows and no way out. Mercer had already won, but James wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Mercer stepped back, standing tall again. You'll think about it. I'll give you some time. Time to reflect on just how much I've already given you. Time to understand how powerless you are in this system. He turned toward the door, but paused just before leaving. Oh, and James, Mercer said without looking back, his voice ice-cold. I wouldn't try anything foolish. The people who are watching you are not as forgiving as I am. The door shut with a soft click, leaving James alone in the dark room. The only sound was the rhythmic beating of his own heart, pounding in his ears. Hours later, James had hardly slept. His mind was consumed with one question. How do you fight a man who owns the world? The answer came to him in a flash. He wouldn't fight Mercer head-on. That would be suicide. Instead, he would find the cracks. Mercer had built his empire on control, but even the strongest foundation could be shaken by the smallest fracture. And James was damn good at finding those fractures, the guard who checked on him twice a day. The dim, flickering lights in the corridor barely illuminated Claire's face as she crouched beside James, motioning him to stay low. Every step they took was measured, deliberate. There was no room for error. The faint sounds of guards moving about echoed through the halls, but Claire seemed to know exactly when to pause, when to move again. James could feel his pulse pounding in his throat. The weight of his restraint was gone, but the mental chains Mercer had placed on him were still heavy. "Where are we going?" James whispered as they rounded another corner, the flickering bulb above them buzzing loudly. Claire didn't look at him, but her voice was steady. "I've been in this facility before. There's an exit, but we have to get through the lower levels. They won't expect us to go that way." James nodded, silently agreeing. He could feel it, the tension in the air. Every guard, every corner could be a deadly trap. If they were spotted, it was over. The authorities who worked for Mercer weren't just trained soldiers. They were merciless. They reached a large metal door, a plain slab of steel that looked more like a vault than an exit. Claire pulled a small device from her pocket, pressing it to the lock. There was a faint beep, a hiss, and the door clicked open with a satisfying sound. James took a deep breath. Claire stepped through first, glancing back to make sure he was following. "This way." The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway behind them. Someone was coming. Claire moved faster, urging him along. There was no time to waste. They descended a set of stairs, the concrete walls damp and cold, the air thick with dust and musty scent. The lower levels were even darker, lit only by occasional emergency lights that barely cut through the gloom. James kept his hand on the back of Claire's jacket, knowing that every second counted. They needed to stay out of sight. Suddenly, Claire stopped, pressing her back against the wall. James froze. Claire's breath was quick and shallow, her face tense. She held up a finger to her lips, signaling for him to be silent. James didn't need to ask why. 2 guards were approaching. He could hear them, heavy footsteps. Claire looked at him, her eyes hard and focused. Without a word, she pulled a small knife from her boot and motioned for James to move. The guards turned the corner just as James moved, slipping between them with surprising agility. He nearly collided with one of them, but Claire was faster. In a fluid motion, she lunged, slamming her knife into the guard's side before twisting, disarming him with a brutal efficiency. The second guard barely had time to react before James knocked him unconscious. The 2 guards slumped to the floor, unconscious and out of the way. They were safe, for now. Claire wiped the blade clean on the guard's uniform before tucking it back into her boot. James looked down at the guards, then back at her. "We're not out yet, are we?" Claire gave a tight smile, the weight of their situation hanging over her like a storm. "Not even close." Mercer's lair back in the control room, Victor Harrington stood behind the glass, watching the tracking. "System flicker with activity. We've lost them," a technician said nervously. "The signal from Carter's cell has gone dark. We've tried triangulating, but—" Harrington's eyes narrowed. His hand clenched into a fist. "That's impossible. They were supposed to be secured." "Where are they?" The technician's face went pale. "Sir, we don't know." Harrington's jaw tightened. Mercer had been clear. If Carter was allowed to escape, there would be consequences. Serious consequences. "Find them," Harrington growled. "Track them down now." The technician nodded and scrambled back to his station, frantically typing commands into the system. Harrington turned to leave, but paused. He hadn't been this angry in years. Carter had been a thorn in his side for far too long. And now, this? A slip-up he couldn't afford. The lower levels, Claire and James moved through the dark, twisting corridors beneath the facility. Their goal was clear now. They had to reach the ventilation shaft on the far side of the building. Once they accessed it, they would be able to crawl through the ducts and out of the facility undetected. But time was running out. As they reached another corner, Claire held up a hand. She motioned for James to stop. The air seemed to freeze, and James immediately understood. They weren't alone. 2 guards were walking their way. They were close, too close. James pressed himself against the wall, his breath shallow. Claire's eyes darted over the hallway, calculating the distance, the angles. James couldn't help but admire her focus. She whispered, "We take them out silently. No mistakes." James nodded. They both knew there was no room for error. If they were caught now, it was game over. The guards came into view. Claire moved. First, swift and quiet. She grabbed one by the throat and spun him into the wall, knocking him out with a single blow. The cold night air bit at their skin as they moved quickly through the darkened streets of the city. The hum of traffic was distant, swallowed by the shadows of towering buildings. The only light came from the occasional street lamp, casting long, twisted shadows on the wet pavement. James could feel the weight of the mission pressing on him. They had escaped, yes, but escape was just the beginning. Mercer wouldn't stop, and Harrington was already aware they were gone. The clock was ticking. Claire moved with purpose, her steps sure as she navigated the maze of alleys and side streets. She didn't look back, didn't hesitate. She was already in the mindset of survival, always one step ahead, always thinking. 3 moves out. James followed, but his thoughts were elsewhere. The name Mercer still burned in his mind, a man who had orchestrated so much of what had gone wrong in his life. The manipulation, the control, the destruction, everything had been calculated. But now, for the first time, he had a chance to strike back. "Claire," he said, voice low. "We need a place to regroup, somewhere out of sight, off the grid." Claire glanced at him over her shoulder, her expression unreadable. "I know just the place." They moved through the city with precision, eventually arriving at a rundown building in an industrial area. It looked like any other abandoned structure. Graffiti on the walls, broken windows, the smell of mold in the air. But to them, it was home for now. Inside, they quickly set up their temporary base. Claire connected to a hidden network she had set up months ago, a safe house of sorts, and began scanning for information. James watched her work, the quiet intensity of her focus settling over him like a blanket. He leaned against the wall, mind racing. The plan had to be flawless. They couldn't afford any more slip-ups. Not now. Not when they were this close to the truth. "What's the next move?" he asked, stepping closer. Claire didn't look up from her screen. "We find Mercer's weakness, his financial network, the foundation of his empire. Once we cut that off, he'll have no power." James crossed his arms. "And how do we do that? We don't even know where he is." "We don't need to know where he is." Claire's voice was steady. "We need to know who's financing him, who's behind the curtain pulling the strings. Once we identify those people, we can expose them. The whole system will collapse." James nodded, though doubt lingered in the back of his mind. Mercer was everywhere, and the man's power seemed endless. But they couldn't afford to think small. They had to go after the heart of his operation. Claire's fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up encrypted files, cutting through layers of data. She muttered to herself as she worked, her expression growing more focused with each passing second. "I've found something," she said, pausing. She tapped a few more keys and a series of names flashed across the screen. James leaned in, his heart skipping a beat. "Who are they?" "These names," Claire said, pointing to the first one. "They're part of Mercer's inner circle. Powerful people who are helping him build his global network. They control the money, the media, the military contracts. This isn't just about politics anymore, James. This is about control of the world economy." James felt his breath catch in his chest. "Who are they?" Claire looked at the list. "Some of these people have names you'll recognize. Global banking executives, influential politicians, corporate CEOs. But others are much harder to pin down. They operate in the shadows, under layers of false identities." James's mind raced. Who were these people? Who could be so deeply entrenched in this global conspiracy? Claire's eyes met his, sharp and determined. "But there's one name here that stands out. A man named Drake Lawson. He's the key. If we take him down, the rest of them will scatter. James's pulse quickened. What do we know about him? Claire scrolled down the screen. Lawson is a financial genius, but he's also a ghost. His companies don't show up in public records. He moves money across countries like it's nothing. He's a shadow. Just like Mercer, but with more power. James's mind clicked into place. This was it. If they could take down Lawson, the rest of Mercer's operation would be vulnerable. We need to find him, James said, determination in his voice. Now. Claire nodded, pulling up more files. I'm already looking into it. We have a contact who might know where he is, but it's not going to be easy to get to him. James didn't care. They had a chance now. A real chance to bring down Mercer, to end everything he'd started, to take back control, a new alliance. The next morning, they met with their contact, a former CIA operative named Carter Quinn, who had gone off the grid years ago after a failed mission. Quinn was a wild card, someone who didn't trust easily, but he owed Claire a favor from their past dealings. They met in an old diner on the edge of the city. The path to Antwerp. The journey to Antwerp was long, but the drive was necessary. They couldn't risk using any conventional travel routes. Mercer had eyes everywhere. No flights, no trains, and certainly no easy paths. The only way to do this was to move in the shadows, just like they had for the past few days. James and Claire had rented a nondescript car, their faces hidden beneath simple baseball caps and sunglasses to avoid drawing attention. The car's engine hummed softly as they navigated through the quiet European countryside, the occasional flash of headlights behind them serving as a reminder that they were being hunted. Claire didn't speak much on the road. Her mind was undoubtedly running over every detail of the mission, planning out every possible contingency, every potential failure. She knew the stakes. They both did. If they messed this up, not only would they be dead, but everyone they cared about would be too. James glanced over at her. We're getting close, he said quietly. She nodded, her gaze focused on the road ahead. I can feel it. The drive had taken most of the day, and as night fell, they found themselves entering the outskirts of Antwerp. The city lights twinkled in the distance, giving the place an almost welcoming glow, but it was deceptive. The darkness of the operation they were about to undertake was far from inviting. They parked in a small, inconspicuous garage just outside the main city center. Their contact, Quinn, had arranged for them to meet an informant there, someone who knew the inner workings of Lawson's shell company and could help them locate the warehouse. The garage was empty except for the dusty cars parked at the far end. The shadows were long, and the air was thick with anticipation. Claire checked the time on her watch and then slid out of the car. We're here, she said, her voice steady despite the tension in her eyes. James followed, looking over the bay parking lot. He caught sight of a figure moving toward them in the shadows, tall, dark silhouette with a slight limp. It was Raphael, their contact, a man who had worked in Lawson's inner circle before disappearing off the radar. Raphael was a rough-edged man with a history of dealing with dangerous people. He didn't trust easily, but he had no love for Mercer or Lawson, the right kind of man for their job. As Raphael approached, he scanned the area, clearly checking for anyone who might be watching. Once he was sure they were alone, he walked up to them and stopped, arms crossed. You two are either braver or more foolish than I thought, he said with a smirk. We didn't come here to chat, Claire replied, her tone sharp. We need information, now. Raphael's eyes flickered to James before he sighed and reached into his coat. He pulled out a small piece of paper and handed it to Claire. This is the address of the warehouse where Lawson's been hiding out, he said in a low voice. I've arranged for you to meet a contact inside. She can help you get what you need. Claire took the paper, reading it carefully. What's the catch? Raphael chuckled darkly. You'll find out soon enough. Lawson's men are everywhere. They're not just going to let you waltz in and walk out with information. James felt a knot tighten in his stomach. The stakes were getting higher. I can handle it, Claire said, tucking the paper into her jacket. We'll be in and out, but if we're going to succeed, we need to move quickly. Raphael studied her for a moment, his eyes cold. Be careful, he warned, before turning on his heel and disappearing back into the shadows. Claire and James exchanged a look, knowing that the next step would be the most dangerous part of their entire mission. They couldn't afford to hesitate, not even for a second. The warehouse. The streets of Antwerp were eerily quiet when they reached the warehouse district. It was a far cry from the bustling city center they had just driven through, empty, desolate, and full of secrets. The warehouse itself was nondescript, just another large gray building among many others. But Claire's instincts told her this was where Lawson had been operating, hiding in plain sight. The dim glow of the streetlights reflected off the dirty windows of the building, casting long shadows on the cracked pavement. James scanned the area, looking for any signs of movement. The street was deserted save for a few parked cars. But the warehouse felt alive in a way that was unsettling. I don't like this, James muttered, his senses on high alert. Claire didn't respond, her focus on the task at hand. She moved toward the building, staying low, her footsteps barely making a sound. James followed closely behind her, their movement synchronized like a well-rehearsed routine. They reached the back entrance of the warehouse, a rusted steel door. That looked as if it hadn't been opened in years. Claire pulled out a small device from her pocket and began to work on the lock. Her hands moved quickly, precisely. The weight of the flash drive felt heavier in Claire's hand than it should have. She tucked it into her jacket pocket with care, her mind already racing with the implications of the woman's words. A weapon? James repeated softly. He didn't need to say more. The thought of it was terrifying enough. A weapon tied to Mercer's plans was something far beyond what they had expected. Claire turned to the woman who was still watching them with a guarded expression. Who else knows about this? Claire asked, her voice steady despite the rising tension. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. Too many people. Lawson's security is tighter than you think, but he trusts no one. If you're going to find this project and get out, you need to be ready for anything. Her voice dropped lower, almost a whisper. If Mercer's pulling? The strings here. This weapon is more dangerous than anything you can imagine. He'll stop at nothing to keep it hidden. James clenched his fists. We're not leaving until we know exactly what this weapon is. No more secrets. The woman nodded, stepping back into the shadows. I've done my part. The rest is up to you. She disappeared without another word, leaving the pair alone in the darkened warehouse. The silence that followed felt thick, oppressive. They knew they couldn't stay here long. Claire glanced at James, the urgency in her eyes clear. We need to find the project. Now. James didn't need any more convincing. Together they moved deeper into the warehouse, their footsteps echoing softly as they passed row upon row of stacked crates. The place was a maze, but they had no time to waste. Every second spent searching was one more second Mercer's people could be closing in. As they approached the far end of the warehouse, the air seemed to grow heavier, colder. Something about the atmosphere felt wrong, like they were getting closer to something much darker than they had anticipated. Then they found it. A massive steel door, much larger than anything else in the building, stood at the end of the hallway. It was locked tight, sealed with multiple layers of security. But Claire wasn't deterred. She moved to the door, quickly examining the lock mechanism with practiced precision. Get ready, she said, her voice barely a whisper. She pulled out a set of tools, her hands working quickly to override the lock. It took a few moments, but the soft click that followed signaled their success. The door creaked open, revealing a room beyond that was bathed in eerie, low light. As they stepped inside, their eyes immediately locked onto a set of large, cylindrical containers lined up in the center of the room. The air was thick with the faint hum of machinery, and the scent of sterile chemicals filled their nostrils. James felt a chill run down his spine. What were they looking at? Claire's voice was steady, but there was an edge of disbelief in it. "This is it. This is the project." They moved closer, their boots muffled by the thick industrial flooring. The containers were tall and metallic, encased in glass. Each one contained a strange, glowing substance. It didn't look like anything they'd seen before. It was liquid, pulsing with an unnatural light, as if alive. The energy in the room seemed to hum with it, a power far beyond. "Anything human?" James reached out to touch the glass, but Claire stopped him with a sharp look. "Don't," she warned. "We have no idea what this stuff is. We need to figure out how it works first. We don't want to release something we can't control." James nodded reluctantly, stepping back. "What do you think it is? Some kind of biological weapon?" Claire squinted at the containers, her mind racing. "Could be. But whatever it is, it's too clean. It doesn't look like anything typical. This could be some kind of energy source, or something Mercer plans to use to control the world on a scale we can't even imagine." Her eyes narrowed as she glanced at the nearby consoles and machinery. "But I'm betting we can find out." They quickly moved to one of the nearby terminals, the cold blue glow of the screen flickering too, life as Claire accessed it. She was a pro at this. She navigated the encrypted files with ease, her fingers flying over the keys, pulling up data on the project. James watched as the documents scrolled across the screen, his mind working overtime to make sense of it all. Finally, Claire's fingers paused over one particular file, and she clicked it open. James leaned in. Project Lazarus. The words on the screen were chilling. Claire's voice dropped to a whisper. "I should have known." "What is it?" James asked, his stomach tightening. "This isn't just a weapon," Claire muttered, scanning the document. "It's a program, an AI." James's heart skipped. "An AI? But how?" Claire's face paled as she absorbed the information. "Mercer's been working on merging neural networks and biotechnology. This project, Project Lazarus, is meant to create the perfect hybrid.